Now, let me make one more comment about the framework itself and then move on to the national human rights institutions. As an indicator of how much of a vacuum there was in this space, I've been so pleasantly surprised at the uptake that the framework has already enjoyed by business and by states in doing their own policy assessments, by NGOs in their analytical and advocacy work, and I think in some respects furthest along various international efforts by international institutions that have responsibility in this area. So for example, the International Organization of Standards, ISO issues standards in a variety of different areas, including quality control, environment, and other such things. They've just concluded, I think, a 7-year effort on something called ISO 26000, a guidance standard for social responsibility. It has in it a human rights chapter that's lifted directly from the framework. With credit, they didn't steal it, they weren't plagiarizing. They said, this is the view of the international community, we'll incorporate it directly. Last Monday, I spent the day with the OECD Investment Committee in Paris. They are updating the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises. The Council of Ministers has said there will be a human rights chapter for the first time in the OECD guidelines. And they said for guidance on what that chapter should look like, consider the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework. So the investment committee invited me along. And the chairman's text for the negotiations, again, the human rights chapter is taken directly from our work. We've had similar success with the International Finance Corporation, which invests in projects in infrastructure and the extractives, along with companies in various developing countries, emerging markets. And we're working very hard on export credit agencies because they play a key role in this area as well. Okay, let me quickly then turn to national human rights institutions. What we're doing, at the end of the day, when you operate at the international level, the best that you can hope to achieve is coherence and clarity at a conceptual and policy level, and at the level of standards. But the real action takes place on the ground. And that's where you are, and that's where you operate, and that's why you are so important in carrying this forward and making it work on the ground. In relation to the duty to protect, for example, the state duty to protect against human rights abuses by third parties, including companies. Important work is to be done in all countries, scrutinizing laws that relate to corporate conduct. For example, securities regulation, corporate law. We did a survey, we had 22 law firms doing pro bono research for us at one point, surveying more than 40 jurisdictions, asking the question of, to what extent does corporate law and securities regulation facilitate or hinder corporate respect for human rights? Now, you think that's an odd question? It isn't when you come from the United States, because we are the most shareholder value-oriented regime when it comes to corporate governance anywhere. And in fact, theoretically, in the United States, if a board of directors allows the company to veer too far away from maximizing shareholder value, they can get sued. So you knock on the door of the company and say, you must do this, you must do that, you must do the other thing, and the response legitimately can be, we don't want to get sued because we're not meeting our fiduciary responsibility. So you've got a problem in the area of corporate law and securities regulation. This is something that the human rights community traditionally hasn't worked with, but if you're going to make progress in the area of business and human rights, you better begin to learn about the areas of law that affect business directly, and the area of regulation that affect business directly. So understanding and scrutinizing laws that relate to corporate behavior at the national level, to review whether they risk undermining human rights or could do more to encourage rights-respecting corporate cultures would be an extremely important contribution on your part. Scrutinizing the implementation and enforcement of laws that protect human rights, where companies are the main actors, of course, would be another. Scrutinizing the human rights performance of state-owned enterprises. You know, that some of you don't have a mandate to address private sector businesses, but you do have a state-related mandate. Well, state-owned companies are state-related. There are significant human rights challenges related to state-owned enterprises in many parts of the world. So under the duty to protect, there's a whole range of areas where very important work can be done by national human rights institutions. Similarly, with regard to the responsibility to respect, raising awareness among companies about what this means, what best practices might be in other places, what emerging standards, best practice standards may be in different sectors, disseminating tools and lessons learned to help companies, and convening dialogue to discuss real dilemma situations, like when companies operate in zones of conflict. The worst, this is a statistical fact, the worst corporate-related human rights abuses take place in conflict zones. It isn't, I'm sure there are companies who actually go to conflict zones because they know that they are more or less law-free environments and they can get away with a lot. But respectable companies don't do that, but they can get drawn into conflict situations inadvertently, and often do. Helping them to address those challenges of how to avoid that kind of involvement in a multi-stakeholder fashion could be extremely useful. Finally, with regard to access to remedy, of course, advising people on what their rights are and what options are available is absolutely critical, and helping people see what is possible under the rubric of business and human rights is an important task. As some of you know, we have developed an online resource, a wiki, on grievance mechanisms for business and human rights. And I believe it's 41 national human rights institutions have posted their own programs on it. I encourage you all to do that. If I remember correctly, it's www.wiki.org. Is that right? Something, I'll double check. But it's Basis Wiki. Sorry, it's not Wiki, it's basiswiki.org. But anyway, post your stuff and share views, share stories, share experience, because it's available in all official languages and even some non-official languages. So it's a useful tool. So in addition to advising people on what their rights and options are, acting as a grievance mechanism to conduct investigations, for example, and make recommendations to government departments. Make recommendations directly to companies, as is done in Kenya, as was already mentioned, in Ghana, for instance. And also, finally, work to resolve business-related disputes through adjudicative mechanisms and mediation and conciliation. And let's build up a sort of a case history of how best to do these things. So there's a lot of work to be done, and all of you are under-resourced. Like anybody else in the human rights field, by definition, we're under-resourced. And so what we have to do is to make the best of each other's knowledge and commitment, and strengthen our networks, our ties among one another, to make it all happen. Now, I don't have any Scottish poetic conclusion, but you know, as you all were citing Robbie Burns, a line from T.S. Eliot popped into mind, which may be appropriate. It's one of my favorites, where it comes from Little Giddens. It says, We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of our exploring will be to return where we started and know the place for the first time. And it's us, it's people, people at the center. That's what we will know for the first time as the result of our journey. Thank you.
Professor Ruggie, thank you for what I found to be an absolutely fascinating contribution to this conference and truly inspirational. We now have a very brief opportunity, and I'm afraid it is a very brief opportunity, to take one or two contributions from the floor of the chamber, from the delegates here. And I see one hand already. I think I probably only have time to take about 3 contributions, which I will take up to 3, and then ask perhaps if the professor would like to respond to them. We'll take the from there if you like. But I see straight away a hand raised in front of me. I think the delegate from the Republic of the Philippines. If you could wait. Yes, your microphone is now on. So.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to Professor Ruggie for his, as always, comprehensive and yet concise and very clear contributions. As you said, human rights advocates tend to have actually turned away from business. They've chosen to be indigent and yet be advocates. And therefore, it does lead to, in a way, a bit of naivete or ignorance, and it is our responsibility to build up. That is one contribution that NHRIs can do, build our own capacities internally. I was a business journalist for several years for CNBC and have an MBA, so I have a little bit of an advantage over that. One thing that I have said in the past at fora at the Human Rights Council side events is that while we always congratulate ourselves on how many people have signed, how many companies have signed up for the Global Compact, one thing that has happened is that many companies feel that they are fulfilling their social responsibility by having foundations. And while that is very good, we do see a disconnect between how companies act and treat their employees and act in their own communities, while they have this very laudable foundation work. In the Philippines, for example, we have a shopping mall real estate development company that does very good work for persons with disabilities, the accessibility, they let all sorts of activities happen. On the other hand, they break labor laws in terms of how they treat their own employees. That's just one example, but it happens all over the world. And Professor Ruggie's work is very, very important in building up a framework, but perhaps we can use our regional mechanisms and our ICC mechanism to share information on how ourselves are building our capacities. Thank you.